Thank you for coming today on the wettest day of the year. My name's Nikki, and I'm the curator at the museum. And we're very excited to have Laurie Carter with us today, who's here to talk about her new book, Emily Carr's BC, which is actually the third in the series. But this one in particular is about Emily's connections to this area. Laurie's a travel journalist and mystery writer. The first book in her Emily Carr BC series, Vancouver Island, was a finalist for Best Travel Book in the North American Travel Journalists Association of 2015 awards. She's also the author of Grandma Wears Hiking Boots, a personal guide to the Okanagan Valley, and co-author with husband Bruce Kemp of Gifts of the Okanagan. Her travel stories and photos have appeared in publications ranging from airline magazines to tourism websites and been recognized with numerous travel media awards. Travel also features in her Taylor Carrot mystery series, which I'm keen to check out. So I first met Laurie 6 to 8 years ago. She's visiting the museum looking for information about Emily Carr. And thanks to a donation from Dave Purvis of a print of Emily's Pemberton Meadows painting, I was able to show her our display of this picture, which hangs on the railway wagon in her transportation exhibit as Emily came to Pemberton by rail in 1933. I was also able to tell her about Eric Anderson, a local historian who'd recently presented at the museum Tea and Tale program about Emily's trip by rail and the fascinating connections she had to people in the Squamish area. Laurie emailed questions to me periodically as she tried to pinpoint where Emily had created her sketch of the Pemberton Meadows painting. I was grateful to be able to reach out to May Walker Menzel, Nee Taylor, who was born and raised in Pemberton, and she's considered Pemberton's oldest Pembertonian. She's lived here close to 90 years. And her recollections of Harvey Nelson Hill, which was a feature along the old road to Mount Currie, was very helpful to the museum's collection and to Laurie's book. It's a wonderful read and a well-researched look at BC through Emily's eyes, so please join us in welcoming Laurie back to the museum to share her adventures with us.
Well, it's lovely to see you here on this very damp day. That's okay, because we've got Emily to, get us all fired up. So let me talk to you a little bit about how this whole journey began for me, the beginning of the 3 books. It actually began in Haida in 2012. And something that I didn't know at the time but discovered later was that it was exactly 100 years after the first time that Emily had been to Haida. So that was kind of an interesting little sidebar there. And you can see here the difference in what it looked like 100 years later. Emily, of course, when she visited there, the village had long been abandoned already, and the village was becoming overgrown. And when I was there, there are still standing poles, which is pretty exciting to be able to see. But it's interesting to note that this right here, that's a pole with a tree growing out of it. Yeah. So as we were touring around, our Haida Watchman guide, his name was Walter Russ, showing us all the things and telling us the stories and so on. And at this point, I have to mention that I actually knew almost nothing about Emily Carr. I'm originally from Ontario, and so, like all Ontario school children, I knew lots and lots about the Group of 7. Right? But not Emily Carr. And at the point that I made this trip to Skidans, I knew that she had been a painter. I knew that she was West Coast. I couldn't have reliably told you if she was from Vancouver or Victoria. And I had no clue whatsoever that she'd ever written anything. So this is how limited my knowledge was on this particular trip. And in fact, Nikki mentioned Grandma Wears Hiking Boots. That was the purpose of my trip. I had gone up there to do a sequel to Grandma Wears Hiking Boots, the guide to the Okanagan. I was going to do a BC guide. So Grandma's Hiking Boots were going to tramp around BC, and it was all going to be lots of fun. And So here I am in Skidance. Now fortunately, my husband, who was with me on this trip, has much better art history knowledge, and he did know quite a bit about Emily Carr. And as we were walking around at one point, he said to Walter, "Do you know anything about Emily Carr coming here?" And Walter said, "Oh yeah, my grandparents were her guides." And now remember, I don't know anything about Emily Carr, and I'm not there because of Emily Carr. So, however, I am a journalist. So I dutifully note in my notebook, "Grandparents guided Emily Carr," and carried on the trip. Well, it happened that the rest of our trip then followed the Skeena River, where else Emily had also gone on that 1912 trip and returned in 1928. And we kept bumping into places that she'd been, and I started to think, wow, maybe I should abandon the hiking boots, right? Maybe Emily is calling to me. Something's going on here. So I started to get interested in her, and I began to research. And very soon the idea came to me that I would do a guidebook of British Columbia based on the places that Emily Carr had lived and worked, because I discovered that there were so many of them and that she had traveled so extensively in the province. So the original idea was one book. It was going to be a travel book. And I was approaching it, I admit this, I was approaching it with a somewhat superficial look. It was travel oriented, and Emily Carr was going to be like the coat hanger, but you know, it wasn't an in-depth thing about Emily Carr. That's not how it started out. But as I started to read, I discovered, oh my gosh, she was a writer. And I started to read the things that she'd written, and I started to get interested in her art. My husband took me to the art gallery in Vancouver, where I just stood mesmerized before some of her forest paintings. The more I got to know her, the more I researched, the more I wanted to research. So what started out to be one book very quickly morphed into two, and then not long after that into three, as it became very apparent to me that there was no way that I could do justice to the material that was accumulating in one or even two books. So that left me with the problem of how to organize this material, because they are still travel memoirs and they are still guides to the places that Emily had been. So if I organized the whole thing chronologically, you'd be playing hopscotch, because she went here and there and all over the place at different times. So it would be very confusing as a travel book that way. So I finally settled on the idea that I would organize it geographically and not worry about the chronology. So I finally decided that I would start with Vancouver Island, and that works out neatly, covering essentially the entire span of her life from 1871 to 1945, because she lived most of her life in Victoria. And a great deal of her travel was around the periphery of Vancouver Island. So that made sense for the first book. As I was researching this one, I started to get deeper and deeper into the detail. And I would say that in the first book, I relied pretty much on published material, Emily's own words published, and biographies and so on about her. But by the time I was getting into the second book, Northern BC and Haida Gwaii, I was starting to get very interested in the material that we don't see so readily. And I was spending a lot of time in the archives in Victoria, and I was finding material there that provided color to the whole story. It was things that had been left out of published materials, but there was so much there that was really interesting. So anyway, the second book wound up being, by contrast to the first one, which covered the entire span of her life, Northern BC and Haida Gwaii covers only 16 weeks of her life. So two trips, one made in 1912, one made in 1928, both summertime trips, about 8 weeks for each trip. But interestingly, each of these trips followed some pivotal event in Emily's life. So in the summer of 1912, she had just returned from a year's study in France, which had totally transformed her attitude toward art and the way that she painted. And she chose to take that new excitement that she had and the new tools and skills and so on, and go north with it. The second time that she went north was in 1928, and this was immediately following her discovery by the Eastern Canadian Art Establishment in 1927, where she was invited to participate in an exhibition in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. But what was really important about that trip was that was when she met members of the Group of Seven. And that's when she met Lauren Harris, and their great friendship began. And that was such an important, I hate to use the word influence, because it implies that Lauren Harris, you know, influenced, that she did things because of what Lauren was suggesting to her. And I don't think that's at all the case. Mostly it was this, the first time that she'd had to really have a collaboration, discussions with another really accomplished artist. So their friendship was extremely important to her work. Which then brought me to the final book. And in searching around for a title, it struck me that All the Leftovers probably wasn't going to, you know, cut it too much. So I came up with What is True, the South Coast of the Interior, but it is all the leftovers. It is all those other trips that she took that didn't fit neatly into what had already been covered. So it's divided into three sections. The first part is Vancouver, the region, covering the period of time that Emily actually lived in Vancouver, and also her exhibitions there after she moved back to Victoria. And then a thing I call the Interior Circle, because it makes sense as a driving tour. So it covers going up to the Caribou and the Okanagan and so on. And then finally, the Sea to Sky, which is the 1933 expedition up this way. By this time, I was really, really getting involved in the little extra details. And I would point out that in all three of the books, I really made an effort to let Emily speak for herself. So I quoted very extensively from her, because I think she put it so well, so often, you know, so just let her say it. And this is where I thought it was unfortunate so often that details that were in those unpublished works would not be seen by most people, unless you happen to be a research nerd like me. So I'll give you an example of one of the ones that I chose to include in the book. This is the point where Emily has gone to France to study for a year, and she's on her way back. Now, you may know about her famous sheepdog, Billy. And she had Billy at this time, and on the way to France, she dropped him off with a friend in Edmonton to look after while she was away. So we pick up the story here where she's on her way home and she's collecting Billy from his exile in Edmonton. It was arranged Billy should be shipped to Calgary and I would pick him up as I came through. We had 20 minutes. I ran into the shed and asked the man if they had a dog for the train. He produced a little yellow mongrel. Then I gave Billy's whistle. Oh, yowl of joy that came from a pile of barrels in the shed. And when he saw me, well, it was just a stirrup of ecstasy, warmth, and sweetness, all mixed up with tears. Then everyone on the platform got nosy, thought the dog was going to eat me up or something, and I bundled him on the train and ended the exhibition. Winnie had written, I am afraid old Billy will hardly hang out till you come. He has aged dreadfully. He was old and fat and gray round the muzzle. But the years dropped from him miraculously. Isn't that wonderful? It's not, you know, it's just hidden away in those archives. So, as I mentioned, the books are arranged geographically, but today I'm going to talk to you with the little backgrounders for the section in this book chronologically. It's easier to deal with that way. Makes sense for this. So, just a little tiny quick backgrounder, remembering that Emily was born on December 13th in 1871 in this house in Victoria. At the time, it was number 44 Carr Street. It's now 207 Government Street. So, no, it hasn't moved anywhere. They just renamed the streets. This was her family. Her mother, Emily, also, and her father, Richard. And then over here, her her four sisters. Emily also had a total of 4 brothers, so there were 9 Carr children in total. 3 boys died in infancy, 2 of them while the family was in England, 1 of them when they first came to Victoria. And then her youngest sibling was Richard, the picture of her with her brother Richard there. And Richard only lived to age 22. He died of tuberculosis. He'd been sick his whole life and he died at 22. So Emily's entire family relationship, as we know it in her stories, is really related with the sisters. Her mother died when she was about 13. Her father died when she was 17. So that's the family that Emily had, the sisters. And for our purposes here, this one particular sister, I should name them. This is Edith, this is Clara, this is Elizabeth or Lizzie, and if you're familiar with the Book of Small, she's big. This is Emily's favorite sister, Alice, who was middle, and then Emily was small. Clara, this one, is the only one of the Carr sisters who ever married. And of course, because there were no boys who married, the Carr name does not carry on at all from this family group. There are no Carr descendants. The descendants came through the Nichols family because Clara married Major John Nichols. So there were Nichols descendants, and then of course married women with all kinds of different names. You know, but there are descendants. They're just not direct descendants. So that's her family group, and the relationship with her sisters could be. It was ambiguous, ambivalent. It was at times not very cordial, and at times it was extremely loving. So I think it was based on a love between the sisters, but there was lots of disharmony over the course of time. Part of which led to Emily decamping to San Francisco in 1890 when she was only 18 years old. This was partly because her father had left Edith in charge of the house and everything, and Emily and Edith never got on well at all. And partly because Emily had decided by this time that she wanted to be an artist, and she knew that she needed training for that. And that's a really important feature that we have to, it's a thread that runs through Emily's entire life that I'll mention again and again. Emily really believed in technical training. Now, she just barely finished high school, but when it came to technical training, she really thought it was important. So she studied for her art. She sought out and got training for her art. And then later, when she decided that she was going to be a writer, she did the same thing again. First thing she did was to take a correspondence course. Then she took a night school course, and she's in her 50s at this point. And she sought out people to critique and help her with her writing. So she was a lifelong learner. When she came back from her 3 years in San Francisco, she sort of set up housekeeping in the Carr family home still. She stayed in Victoria for a year, and she most famously there set up the Cow Barn studio. So she decided that she was going to be, she's had training now, she's an artist, and so she needs a studio. Also, she needs to make a living somewhat, and so she discovers that there's excuse me so much, there's a market for teaching children art. And so she starts out doing that in the dining room of the Carr family home, but Edith puts a stop to that fairly quickly because the kids are noisy and messy and stuff like that. And so in typical Emily fashion, this is one of the key features of Emily's character, is that she is intensely practical as well as being very stubborn. So she was going to have a studio, and she decided then that what was the best way to do that? Well, right behind the house there was a cow barn. And so she let the cows stay in the bottom of the cow barn, and she had some help and took the hayloft and turned that into her studio. And interestingly, she said that she had an old pair of boots that she hung over a rafter up there, and she used to put the money from her lessons into the boot. And the reason for that was that she wanted more training, and she wanted to go to Europe to study. And so that was how she was saving up to be able to go and get her next round of training. Also, interestingly, it appears that this was a sort of a place for trysts between some of her friends. Of course, they're all young people in Victoria at this point, and you know, it's Victorian still, so young people have a little difficulty getting together with some privacy, and I take it that Emily's studio was quite busy from time to time. You can see the sort of lifestyle she was living. This is a tennis party held on the Carr family grounds. They had a tennis court. And one of these gentlemen here, either this one or this one, was named Mayo Padden, and he fell very much in love with Emily, to the point that when she went to England to study, he followed her. all the way to London. And for 3 months, she says he proposed to her every single day. But Emily realized something. She knew that a woman at that time, number one, it was difficult for a woman to be taken seriously as an artist at all. And number two, if she was going to be a serious artist, then she couldn't also be a wife. She knew that if she became a wife, then the art would have to take second place. And she was very right about that, because she had 2 friends who also studied art in Europe at that point, and you're not hearing their names. This was final thing here, the period when she made her first trip to an indigenous village, to actually stay in a village. Now, Emily had had contact with indigenous people her whole life. They were a fact of life around Victoria. The Songhees people were right there. And we're still in the period where the Haida are paddling down to trade every year. They paddle all the way from Haida Gwaii to Victoria, right? So she has had plenty of experience with indigenous people, but she's never actually lived among them before. And that's what happened in the summer of 1899 when she went to Ucluelet. And she stayed at the mission there. And that's where she got the name Kleewick, the laughing one. And it has to do with the fact that Emily was just lousy at languages, mostly because she couldn't be bothered. And so with a couple of words of Chinook and a lot of sign language and hilarity and so on, she was able to converse with people, and they called her the laughing one, Kleewick. That's where the name came from. So then she heads off to England to study again. And from 1899 to 1904, she's in England and getting excellent instruction there. Here's Emily and an easel in the artist colony at St. Ives. So she studied at the Westminster School in London, she studied at St. Ives, and she also studied at another artist colony in a place called Bushy. But England didn't treat Emily all that well in terms of her own well-being. And by 1903, she was in such a bad state that the family, actually the end of 1902, friends in England contacted her family and said, somebody better come over here and see about Emily. So Lizzie came over, not really the best choice from Emily's point of view, but anyway. And the beginning January of 1903, Emily was put into a sanitarium, and she was there until March of 1904. So essentially she had a nervous breakdown. The sanitarium that they put her into, though, was a tubercular sanitarium. And so people are going there to die, right? Imagine taking a person who's suffering from depression and putting them in such a place. Anyway, that's where she was. And it came to a point where, toward the end, they were trying things with her like electric shock and so on. Her treatment there was really horrendous. And she wrote about it eventually, not just after her stay. And one of the things that Emily's quite famous for, she called them her funny books. Emily had a fabulous sense of humor. She was a gifted storyteller, and she loved to write little doggerel verse, and she was a very good cartoonist. And so she created this particular little book, which was eventually published after her death in 1953 under the title Pause. It was a pause in her life, and it was her experiences in the sanitarium. So she came back in 1904. Now, so I've set the stage for you. Emily is not in great shape mentally. She's just had a pretty terrible experience for the last well over a year. And she's also making this bizarre transition. So picture London in 1904. It is the absolute pinnacle of the British Empire. It's the Edwardian period. London is the center of commerce, it's the center of culture, and Emily goes from this basically back to the 19th century. She gets on a steamer and comes across the Atlantic. She gets on a train and crosses the continent. She gets off the train at Ashcroft and climbs onto a stagecoach. And she then spends 2 full days, from 4 o'clock in the morning one day till 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the next day, traveling up the Caribou Road to 150 Mile House. Now, why is she doing this? Well, she's doing this because she had some very good friends from Victoria who had written to her just before she left England and said, look, come and visit us. They were from Victoria but had moved up to 150 Mile House, and come and stay with us. They knew she wasn't doing all that well. And it's interesting that the caribou, Emily said the caribou, she said it sort of healed her. It was a wonderful experience for her, and I'm sure did a great deal more for her than any of that time in the sanitarium did. She loved the open spaces, she loved going out and riding, she loved the colors there. She was there in late August and early September, and so it was golden. You know, and she talks about it being gold country, not because of what they dig out of the ground, but because of what it looked like. So she really, really enjoyed that time. And here's another little Emily character thing for you. You'll notice how she's sitting on this horse. Up until this point, Emily had been a very proper little Victorian/Edwardian young lady and always ridden side saddle. But in the caribou, she learned to ride astride, which was fine in the caribou, but when she took this habit back to Victoria, well, you can just imagine. Yes, so anyway, but she didn't care. She didn't care. This was more practical, it made sense to her, so that's how she rode for the rest of her life. Fast forward then, she spent a year in Victoria when she got back. 1905 she spent in Victoria, and actually put her cartoonist skills to work. She was doing cartoons for a publication called The Week newspaper, political cartoons. But in 1906, she moved to Vancouver, where again, I'm not going to go into huge details on this because I could spend a day talking about her time in Vancouver. She again turns to teaching. And first of all, with the ladies' art group, that lasted a month. She was fired because Emily wanted to be a serious art teacher. She wanted these people to learn, and these are ladies who wanted to drink tea and daub a little paint on a canvas now and again, so you can imagine that that didn't sit too well. But that's okay. Emily, again, totally practical, said that's fine, that didn't work out, I'm getting a studio here, puts an ad in the newspaper, and next thing she knows, she's got students again, children. Emily was in fact a very gifted teacher. She was beloved by her students. She had as many as 75 students at a time. And this is how she made the majority of her living during this period of time. And she did very well, well enough that she could buy some lots on speculation in the New Hastings town site. She was doing okay. And also to finance her travels in the summers. And I think one of the most telling things here, here's Billy. Billy's still with us at this point. Is that this is a picture done by one of her students. It's just lovely, isn't it? So here's teacher, Miss Carr, and she was famous immediately for the menagerie. She always was surrounded with animals. So we had not only Billy at this point, but we also had Sally, the Australian cockatoo, and then we had Jane, the parrot. And during this time, she had 2 white rats, who very frequently became many more than 2 white rats. And she had chipmunks that she'd pick up, and she acquired a vulture when she was on a trip to Seychelles one summer, and you know, so this was her thing. So you can imagine how the kids loved this, you know, this craziness in her studio. It was also during this time that she met Sophie Frank. And Sophie was a Salish woman who lived at the mission at Uslan in North Vancouver. And she came to Emily's studio one day selling woven baskets, and Sophie was really talented at making these baskets, and Emily just loved them. There's a beautiful story, all in the book, about how they became friends, and they became fast friends. And Emily would cross on the ferry from Vancouver over to North Vancouver regularly, every week or two, to go and visit with Sophie. And I'm sure it brightened Sophie's life a lot. Sophie had a very, very hard life, and we don't need tears, so we won't go into that right now. But their friendship lasted through the rest of Sophie's life. And Sophie had very strong connections to Squamish, which we're going to find a little bit more about in a bit now. But this particular portrait of Sophie was included in the front of Cleawick, the first book that Emily had published. And Cleawick was dedicated to Sophie, so it really says a great deal about her relationship with this Indigenous woman. It was also during this period that Emily launched upon her mission, self-imposed mission. She decided to take her sister Alice on vacation, so they went on an Alaska cruise, which was a very well-developed tourism route even this early. And on the way, she had her first experiences of the monumental Indigenous art. So remember, she's been surrounded by First Nations people all her life, and she had been over to Ucluelet, but the Nuu-chah-nulth people were not carving poles at that point. And neither were the Salish people that she was familiar with. And of course the Haida weren't bringing their poles with them when they came down from the north. So she had not had any first-hand experience with the poles. And she was just knocked out by this. First at Alert Bay where they stopped, and then at various villages that they either stopped at or saw on the way to Alaska. And then in Alaska, the Tlingit people who are related to the Haida also are people of the pole, right? So she immediately recognized that this was art, that this was culture of the highest order. Now put this in the context of her time and the settler population. And the stated government policy of both the federal and provincial governments that Indigenous culture would be assimilated. That was it. They were getting rid of it. On her way, she saw that poles were being carted off to museums. She saw many poles fallen. She didn't quite understand at this point that that was supposed to happen, but she saw them fallen and didn't think that they were being replaced. And she didn't see anybody doing new carving. So she firmly believed that this culture was going to be totally lost. So she set it as a mission for herself that she would go north every summer and she would try to paint as many of these poles in position as she possibly could to try and preserve this culture for future generations. I mean, imagine taking this upon herself. I think it's fascinating. And you have to put her in the context of her times and the complete lack of understanding of Indigenous culture. And where her head was at was generations, not decades, generations ahead of where her contemporaries were. So then, she's been doing this, she's going north every summer, she's doing all this stuff, but you know what, she's not satisfied because she feels like to really get a hold of this art thing, she's heard that Paris is the place she's got to go. So again, she's saved up her money and she takes off with her sister Alice in tow. Now Alice's job, I think, essentially was to learn French, which she did because Emily never did. And away they go off to France. And here's some of the fun little pieces in the book that come out of this trip, because they do some sightseeing on the way. And their first stop was at the Sicamous Hotel in Sicamous on Shuswap Lake. And at this time, this was a really amazing, one of the iconic CP hotels. And her story, recorded in another of her funny books, which she made for Alice as a sort of journal on this trip, recounts how on this beautiful, high-class hotel, their most memorable experience was having the ceiling fall on their heads in their room. And the fact that because of that, and her dressing down of the manager in the morning, they didn't have to pay for their room. Their very next stop was Glacier House, which again, at the time, was one of these iconic hotels, wonderful hotel. And the reason that they were there was to see the Great Glacier, which is now the oh geez, and I can usually do this just Illecillewaet Glacier, which at the time, the toe of that glacier, then it was known as the Great Glacier then, came down very close to the hotel. And in fact, the CP Railway had routed the line in order to take advantage of this and put the hotel there. This was all a big marketing thing. They knew what they were doing when it came to tourism. And so she and Alice and Billy go off. They still got Billy with them at this point. Go off. This is them coming up to an ice cave, and she talks about drinking prehistoric water in the cave. So it was really cool. Unfortunately, now the glacier is receded about 1.75 kilometers and isn't even visible from where the hotel was. Although you can walk around the ruins of the hotel is gone. So after her trip to and her study in France, she came back to Vancouver in 1911 with what she called fresh seeing. She had learned in France, she'd been exposed to the Impressionists, she'd been exposed to Fauvism, she'd started painting in oil. Up until that point, Emily only painted in watercolor. So it really, really had a huge impact on her. And in fact, that's what they're talking about in the exhibition that's on at the O'Dane right now, is how this French experience impacted on her art. But here's just a quick look at the difference. Same subject, 1908 and 1912.
Wow.
Yeah. And what did she do? The moment that she got back, she took all this excitement and she headed north to the villages, and she expanded, because at that point she hadn't gone beyond Alert Bay. So in this trip in 1912, now she goes to the Queen Charlotte Islands and goes to the Skeena country. And I just point out here the various forms of transportation that she would be involved with. So steamers going up the coast. The inlander rather, that's a Skeena River paddle wheeler. And Emily had this habit, just because of the time when she lived, of being present at really interesting points in history. And it happens that Emily took the inlander on either its last or its second last ever run up the Skeena River, because the railway was just being completed. In fact, the railway was there and they were just waiting for a bridge to span the Skeena River and the rail link would be complete. So at the end of the summer that Emily took that trip, the inlander was beached and that was the end of her, and Emily actually came back on the train. And you think I just backtrack to another of these exciting things. Emily was in England at the time that Queen Victoria died, and she attended Queen Victoria's funeral. And she was in France at the time of the coronation of King George V, and she's actually written notes about, she wrote a letter to somebody, that, well, she really couldn't be bothered going over to England for it because she couldn't see all the food about putting a crown on an old guy's head. But, but she was living through these very, very interesting times and was actually part of a lot of it. And the final thing I really want to underline here is look at what Emily is wearing. A lot of my presentations, I wear a full-length skirt and the high-necked collar and the, one-sleeve blouse, starched cotton thing. If I'm talking about the period where she was traveling dressed like this, which was really most of her travel. And the skirt has lots of room in the back for the bustle, which Emily tells a hilarious story about her time in Haida Gwaii and one experience with her bustle. And of course, corsets. She was a Victorian woman, would never have gone anywhere without wearing her corsets. So I'd just like to point out that when she was in Haida Gwaii, for example, she would have started out, say, in Skidegate. Her guides took her aboard what she called a gas boat, so gas-powered as opposed to steam-driven. And they would go out to one of the old villages, dragging a canoe behind them. And they would anchor out off the village. And Emily, dressed like this, would clamber down into the canoe. And all her sketching gear and everything would come along, and Billy and everything. And then she'd be paddled ashore, and then on shore she'd have to clamber out of the canoe through the water and so on, and get on shore and do her painting and whatnot, and then do this whole thing in reverse, dressed like that. So I would like to add, Emily Carr, obviously an intrepid traveler, because she's out there going to lots of places, particularly up the Skeena, where white settlers wouldn't have considered going. There's no way, and certainly not a woman traveling by herself with no other companion than a dog. Yeah. So in 1913, she did a solo exhibition in Vancouver, the first of its kind in the city, where she showed some 200 works, which is the output of that time since 1907. She was a very, very prolific artist. And it was really well received. Emily likes it. She sort of made a picture of herself as, being hated by everybody and nobody could stand her art after she'd been to France and so on and so forth. And there were elements of that were true, but she also got a lot of really good press. I've read the stories in the Province and the Sun and so on. So for the rest of her life then, she moved back to Victoria. And she had this really great idea that she would build this apartment house on a lot she had that had been carved out of the family plot just around the corner from the Carr house. And it was a very practical idea. She was going to have, the bottom was apartments, and she built a beautiful studio for herself up above, and she was going to be able to collect rents to make money and be able to be a full-time artist. And virtually the moment that she opened the doors, the whole thing just fell apart. 1913, there was an economic downturn, 1914, the First World War started, and her whole plan just never worked. And so she launched into what she called the bitter years, where she says she didn't do any art at all. That's not true. She did do art, but her output was vastly reduced from what it had been. And she was reduced to doing things like raising dogs. She had dog kennels, 2 different types. One was raising sheepdogs, the other was Belgian Griffons, to make money. And she was very successful at that. Typically, Emily, whatever she put her mind to, she did it really well. And so she was a very successful dog breeder. She was also making pottery because it would sell to the tourists. And this is the period of time when the caricature of Emily develops, the middle-aged woman pushing the baby buggy around the streets of Vancouver, or Victoria rather. But one more time, here is Emily just being practical. And the fact that Emily really didn't care what people thought. So why is she pushing the baby buggy? Well, she's running a boarding house. Oh, I forgot to mention, things got so bad in the boarding house that she couldn't even just go along with having the apartments. She actually turned her studio into space for boarders, and she moved up into the attic. And so now she's cooking for boarders, right? So she's got to cook for boarders, she's got to bring meat and stuff home for all these dogs, and she collects her own clay to make the pottery. So what is the baby buggy for? It's a shopping cart, right? It's a mode of transportation for a woman who doesn't have a car to get all of this stuff home. Just very practical. And I point out that in this time, she living up in the attic, you can imagine that she was pretty depressed by all of what was going on here. But she made herself feel a little bit better by painting these wonderful images in the rafters. Her bed was right underneath these bare rafters, just like this, in the ceiling. And she painted these up there. And it was, the House of All Sorts came to be known as the House of All Sorts because that was her second book around her time running this whole boarding house operation and apartment building. But it's in private hands now, and so most people never get to see this. And I was just so fortunate 4 weeks ago to be allowed to climb up into this attic and actually see. So these are my photographs of those things, and it was an experience like none other, I can tell you. So in 1927, she did still travel a little bit, and she went up to the Okanagan. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this one, but for me personally, as far as the research was concerned, this was really exciting because I lived in the Okanagan for 26 years, and that's where I lived when I was doing all of these books. And at the time, nobody knew exactly when she'd been there. It was sometime in the early 20s, that's all there was. And I will just jump to the bottom line here and say that through my research, finally at the 11th and a half hour, I actually found out exactly when Emily Carr was in the Okanagan. And I made a connection with her story last in Bobtails through an ad that she placed in the Penticton Herald newspaper. So for me as a researcher, that was really a highlight moment, being able to find these details and add to the Emily Carr story. So I mentioned that in 1927 she was discovered by the Eastern Canadian Art Establishment, and after that immediately went back up north, right? So now she's got this connection with the Group of Seven, and what does she do? She heads north again to try out, her newfound excitement. Essentially what happened after that time in Toronto was that on the train coming back, she said, I have just wasted so much time with this whole apartment house thing and trying to make a living and everything. She said, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going back to painting. And she called it herself a tangent tear. I'm going on a tangent tear. And that's exactly what she did. And of course, then you get the huge flowering of her talent in the rest of her life. Which brings us to 1933, when she made her last great expedition away from the Victoria area. And she started in Brackendale and then went all the way up to Lillooet. So she's traveling on the PGE train. So she takes the steamer to Squamish, is picked up there, goes to Brackendale, goes all the way up to Lillooet, then comes back to Seton Portage and wraps up here in Pemberton. Now in Brackendale, she's gone there on a family visit. So remember Clara, the one who was married? Well, one of her daughters was named Lillian, and Lillian had married a man named Lawson Ray in Brackendale, and they had a farm there. So Emily had gone to actually stay with her niece and great nieces and nephews and so on. And Lawson was, he was the superintendent of roads, and so he was out driving around all the time doing his job. We took Emily with him. So she was able to get around the area sketching and so on because of this.
I wondered how she got around so much.
There we go. Isn't that cool? Yeah. And we had a lot of fun. This is where those of you who know about Eric Anderson, where Eric comes in, because Eric took me under his wing in Brackendale and Squamish and showed me all around the sketching places and everything. And he's been a wonderful source of information. And also other people. There is a relative, sort of oblique relative of Emily's in the area who's done a book on the Squamish history, so she was also a great help in this whole thing. And why have I got a picture of Sophie in here? Well, just by happenstance, while Emily was visiting William, Sophie and her husband came up to Squamish, and so they all got together, and Emily tells this beautiful story about what a happy time it was. It was a happy family time, and she was so thrilled to be reunited with Sophie and so on. So that was a really nice part of the trip for her. Then she heads up to Lillooet. Here's a terrible, sad story about what happens to Emily's dog in Lillooet. Again, I'll leave you to read that because we don't need tears. I went to Lillooet looking for locations. I was interested to see if I could find any of the places that seemed obvious to me about her pictures. Well, Emily made it pretty easy in Lillooet because we have sketches that she did. So here's a sketch, and here's a sketch, and she's gone so far as to write the names of the stores on the stores, which you can match up perfectly with the historical photographs. And then here we have the distinctive shape in the resulting oil painting. This particular one is called Houses Below Mountain. And I think what this is looking down the street of Lillooet, and this is Mount Brew in the background, just across. This isn't actually the Fraser that you're looking at here. The angle is, you're looking more south rather than east and west. So you're looking down, and that's Cayuse Creek. That's coming in there just before it connects with the Fraser. So I'm pretty sure. But anyway, the shape of the houses and everything make it very clear where we are in this picture. So that was kind of fun. You could see that one.
And Lillooet was well documented.
Oh yeah, they're just a wealth of photographs and all kinds of things from there. So that one was, that made it easy. And she made it so easy for us with the sketches. And I was also really interested in Titget, so going up to what she knew as the rancherie. So on the bench, just if you're thinking, everybody know where this is, so I don't have to try to explain it, or no, okay. So if you're coming out of Lillooet, heading south, just before you would take the bend to take the Duffin Lake Road, that's where the train station was, just sort of in that corner area there. And right across from where the train was, quite close to where it is now, right across from that, there's a big steep stony bank, and on top of that is a big flat bench. And the rancher, what she knew as the rancherie, is up on top of this bench. And even now, you can see there's a path. People walk up and down this path up to the rancherie all the time. Now, the reason I make a point about this is that, oh no, I'm going to do just something else before I do that. So, you can see here, again, historic photos and her sketches and so on. This picture is more of, more of an interpretation. This is an on-site sketch, but very clearly that's where this is. I don't think there's any doubt. The way to really nail it down is by the church, because this is the church that was there. It's not there anymore, but it was. So I think that's pretty clear where that one is. And then there was the whole question, another mystery that I wanted to solve was this picture called Catholic Church Lillooet. And when I was in Lillooet, I had a lot of people there tell me different theories about what this church was. So then of course now I'm really interested. I want to find out where this church is. And I did finally, oh, sorry, I didn't put the picture in here. I did finally find through a historic photograph again. I found an aerial photograph, and the real tip-off is the little fence around it and the little L shape. You can see the little L coming out of the back of it there. And in fact, it was just that. It wasn't a church on a reserve. It wasn't a missing mission church. It was the Catholic Church in Lillooet. We just didn't believe her. And in fact, it's still there. They moved it. So St. John the Baptist Church in Lillooet is this. It's got little bits and pieces have been added to it, but that's the church. And then we come to the cemetery. Okay, so this was really interesting to me because there was a story that Emily started while she was still on this 1933 trip. And it's in loose, it's written out, by hand, and the sheets are loose at the end of her journal for this trip. And she'd started a story called Life and Death. And the thing about this story is that it deals with the cemetery, and she describes the cemetery and so on. And these very bizarre tombstones that she finds there are headstones, and they're all marked with this capital I, period, capital P, capital O, capital O. So what have we got here? I-po, E-poo, what is this? And she's noodling over this. What does this mean? And finally, it dawns on her that what it actually is that the P is a 9 transposed. And in fact, what it's saying is 1900. And so in this story called Life and Death, she talks about these tombstones. But that story was never published. It was just a draft. And then there's another story that was published called Century Time, and that's where she goes into detail about the 1900 and so on. And Century Time is about how the indigenous people counted in the centuries rather than in minute days and months. And she describes the cemetery in that story. Now the interesting thing is that the cemetery she describes in Life and Death is not the same description as you get in Century Time. And so I was really interested when I came here to see if I could track down these cemeteries. So in Emily's description, so in the story Life and Death, the not published one, she writes, white man's clothes were cavorting in ecstasy on the station master's clothesline as if rejoicing in their purity and in the freedom from containing the weight of humanity. The same merry wind laden with the acrid smell of wild sage met me as I climbed it up the loose stony path. I met an Indian woman. Is this the way to the rancherie? Yes. It was flat country now. There to the right was the village, muddle of broken huts shadowed by the mountains. To the left was the cemetery, full of white crosses shining out against Cayuse Mountain, carefully fenced with hand-hewn timber and wire, the gate rudely arched and surmounted by a cross. Okay, so it's my contention because if you walk up that stony path now, directly beside where the station master's house was, with those clothes that would have been fluttering on the clothesline, you walk up there, and what do you get? You get onto this flat land. The smell of sage is in your nostrils there. On the left is the cemetery, and on the right is the village. So there is very little doubt in my mind whatsoever. This is her sketch of it over here. And you see she talked about the gates surmounted by the cross. And here's a historic photo, probably around that time of what it looked like. And so I think that's a definite. And the mountain in the back, yes, thank you for pointing out. This, in fact, she calls it Cayuse Mountain, but what it is Mount Brew. When you're looking at the cemetery, that's what's there. And it's a huge eminence. It's this massive lump right behind there. And not surprising that she would get that name wrong because it's in the Cayuse Range, or Cayuse Range, and Cayuse Creek goes right in front of it. So she no doubt had heard the word and simply applied it to the mountain. I think it's, easy to understand how she would have done that. So that's great. I'm pretty sure that's the cemetery in in life and death. But now what do I do about the cemetery that she describes in century time? Because it's not the same. Okay. A big stump field, swampy and green, separated them, the village and the cemetery. There was no road into the cemetery to be worn dusty by feet, or stirred into gritty clouds by hearse wheels. The village had no hearse. The dead were carried by friendly hands across the stump field. The wooded part of the cemetery dropped steeply to a lake. You could not see the water of the lake because of the trees, but you could feel the space between the cemetery and the purple-topped mountain beyond. In the late afternoon, a great shadow mountain stepped across the lake and brooded over the cemetery. Dark came and held the shadow mountain there all night. Okay, well, that's definitely not this cemetery, because there's no stump field, there's no lake, the mountain's in the wrong place, it's to the south, it couldn't possibly cast this shadow, it's just everything about it is wrong. That's not the cemetery. So I'm trying to figure out, where is this cemetery? Well, in my favorite biographer's book, the biographer is Gerda Morey, and the book is Unsettling Encounters, she says that the cemetery is in fact here, St. Paul's at Shalath. So we're going to Seton Portage now, and so Shalath is just up from the end of, from the south end of Seton Lake, and I was able to find the cemetery with no difficulty because I had the great good fortune of the first person I asked, who was at the desk at the hotel where I was staying at Seton Portage, said, "Oh yeah, my grandfather," it's always one of these, "yeah, my grandfather," and honestly, that's what she said, "my grandfather helped build it." And so she told me exactly how to get there and where to find it, and I never would have without that. There's no way. So anyway, I get over there, and I find this, and I think, okay, well, you know, we've got a gate, that's good, and there's a lake, and who knows, at the time there were probably trees, might have been taller, so that certainly could make sense, that they were in the way and you couldn't see it. Problem is, we're looking to the east here. So we got Big Mountain over there, that's not going to cast a shadow over this at any time. And what we're on is actually a ridge. So there's no big mountain to cast a shadow. There's nowhere for a shadow to be cast. It's just going to be as happens in the mountains, you know, night rises and falls up the mountains, but there's no movement of a shadow. So I'm thinking, okay, that's not making me very happy. Also, there's a problem with the stump field and the flat ground, because this is half of the church, it turns out. This is a really steep, so we're on a steep slope like this. And at the bottom, the railway goes by at the bottom of it, and then the church was on this tiny little space beside the railway, and this cemetery is up the mountain behind that, and you have to actually go around a switchback to be able to get up to the cemetery.
The Bridge River town site?
Yes, yeah, just beyond,
Mountain.
just below, exactly,
Right.
exactly. And so there's definitely no, you know, there's no level ground, there's no swampy ground, because we're on very well-drained hill like this. So that, it just doesn't match her description, right? I'm thinking, oh, then what? So I get back to Seton Portage, and I went into there was a little coffee shop thing there, and I was chatting with the people and telling them what I was doing and so on, and they said, "Oh, we have another cemetery." You do? Right, where is it? So they pointed me out. So on Seton Portage, there are two mission churches. One is right at the foot of Seton Lake, right at the beach there, and that shows up in one of Emily's sketches. And there's another one right at the top of Anderson Lake. So they're at opposite sides of the isthmus, right? And the one at the top of Anderson Lake is called St. Mary's at Nikayat. So again, they gave me directions on how to get there, and over I go. Well, now look what we've got. It's relatively level ground here. Certainly around this, trees had been cleared, so there could easily have been a stump field at the point when she was there. Right in there is Anderson Lake. behind the screening trees. And right here, not visible in the picture, is this great honking mountain in exactly the right position to bring a shadow across the cemetery in the late afternoon. So I think the cemetery in century time is this one. It's St. Mary's in Nikayat. And I think the cemetery in the draft story, Life and Death, is the one in Lillooet. So there are my thoughts. So, but this is the fun that I have out there trying to figure these things out.
And I love how you meet the granddaughter, whose grandfather was involved with.
Yeah, exactly. It's just too cool. And it turns out he's written up in the local book about Seton Portage. And he was a very well-known character, lived to 103 and so on. So it's like, really, really interesting. So yeah, these are my thoughts on the cemeteries. Which brings us now to Pemberton, again in a quest for locations, and very happily brings me here to this museum. Now with the hubris of the Emily newbie, I came here in the first summer of my actual research on Emily. So now I do know who Emily Carr is, and I'm trying to research her. And I came here thinking, not a problem. These mountains all have names and everything. And she tells in her journal this harrowing story that she has of going on a hike on Harvey Mountain. So I fully expected I was going to come here and, talk to the nice curator at the museum, and she was going to show me a map, and there would be Harvey Mountain. And I fully expected that I was going to come here and look up, and behold, there would be the mountain from her painting, The Mountain. Well, first of all, it was completely fogged in when we arrived, so there weren't any mountains of any kind. I didn't get to see the mountain or any mountain, just like today. Just like today. And then I came over here and met Nikki, and she gave me the, death blow of telling me, I'm sorry, there is no Harvey Mountain. No, really, there has to be a Harvey. No, there's no Harvey Mountain. Good. So that's where we left it at that point. So my trials and tribulations with Pemberton actually resulted in 3 trips here because I just couldn't let it go. So I kept coming
back.
And
a few emails.
Just a few emails, yes. And that would be the problem. That's what would precipitate another trip, is I'd find a historic photograph, or I'd find some reference, or Nikki had put me onto this wonderful book that was so helpful, and your lovely people who were, giving us input and everything, and we're finally working our way through this, and then I'd have to come back and have a look for myself. So, as you point out, we finally figured out that Harvey Mountain had to have been Harvey Nielsen Hill. And so this is the view that I think Emily had, what she called a middling view, which prompted her then to keep climbing up this mountain into what she called a veritable bear rancherie. It was quite an experience. But she did leave a detailed description in her journal about getting there, and she talks about walking over. She followed the railway tracks, and she crossed 3 trestles, and she crossed the Lillooet River, and she talks about the Lillooet River, and then she carries on, and then she gets to this hill, and then she does all the climbing and everything. So there's not even the tiniest shred of doubt in my mind that Harvey Hill is the Harvey Mountain that she was talking to about, and in fact, I found in the unpublished version of her description that she mentions, in one reference she mentions Harvey Mountain, but in the other reference she calls it Harvey Hill. So it's no leap at all. I think that's exactly what she did. She was staying in the Pemberton Hotel, followed the railway tracks. Now at this point I could only find 2 bridges, right? One over the Lillooet River and one back farther this way. But there we go, right there is the 3rd one that I had to assume had, at some point while they were doing flood control and all that stuff, turned it into a culvert, and sure enough, I'm told that's just exactly what happened to it. So there were 3 bridges there. And even if it's not exactly that one, I just believe that that's what happened, right? It just makes sense. She was very definite about 3. 2 are obvious now. But all that work that was done It's just not beyond, you know, reason that a trestle got turned into a culvert. So that was a lot of fun, but I'm still looking for locations, right? So when you look at Mount Currie from that particular vantage point, I can actually see why she said it was sort of middling, because you don't get that same sense of eminence that you do when you're here in the village and you see the mountain up above you. And also, you're looking at the north face. She was here, even though she was here in June, I was here a little bit later than that, but look at the shadow on this thing. I mean, it's a north face, so the lighting on it would be terrible for an artist trying to, you know, see anything to really do anything with. So I figured that wasn't it, and no wonder she was not too thrilled. So what is the location? Well, while I was standing in that place, I used my telephoto lens and was able to isolate various places, and I think that could be part of what was in her head, was that she was taking away individual views that she had from various times, various times and places in the valley. And that might explain something about the shape, you know, because look at that. I'm able to isolate out of that something that's roughly the shape of her painting simply by zeroing in on it. It doesn't look like a whole view, it looks more like a little piece. So I'm not saying that's it. All I'm saying is that I think that this could be part of what happened. And interestingly, the shape, when you look at the shape in these two pictures, the one from Lillooet on the right has quite a lot of similarity to the one. So my thinking is that she's just like dealing with mountains, because of course this painting, The Mountain, was done in the studio when she got back to Victoria, and it was when she was wrestling with this whole notion of mountains, trying to make mountains work, and she had a terrible time with it. Her diary for months is filled with her struggles trying to paint these mountains. And she said that finally she took the village right out at the bottom. She just tried to do the mountain. And then later she put buildings in to try and give scale to this massive mountain. But look at the remarkable resemblance of these buildings to Titkin, right? So I think she just, okay, these are buildings, I've got pictures of these buildings, I'm going to drop those buildings in here, you know. I think that, so it strikes me that it's all...
Because she's working from all her sketches.
She's working from all her sketches, sure. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So now Pemberton Meadows, on the other hand, we've been talking about this one a lot, but I had come to the conclusion of my last trip here, and then I went home and I spent a lot of time with Google Maps in the geo view, you know, the satellite view, and just trying to look at angles where you might get something like the row of houses in the right orientation with the mountain in the right place and all that sort of thing. And unhappily, she didn't leave us these sketches. Where Lillooet, you know, we've got all the sketches that went into it. With this picture, there are no sketches. Well, first of all, the Pemberton Meadows title had me really confused. I mean, was she actually at Pemberton Meadows? Or was she talking about the Pemberton Meadows that was way over, you know, the other end of the valley now, what it was originally called? But then I discovered that really, as was pointed out to me, and in many places I discovered this, that Pemberton Meadows, the term, was often used to describe the entire area. And so I think that's what she was doing.
Early turn of the century time,
yeah. Yeah. And I think now that this was from, what is it, Astor Street? Yeah, just the end of Astor Street. If you go right up that hill and you look down, you'd be looking down what was... See, these are at that point, 1933, the only buildings in that orientation were along that street. Because over here could be the hotel and the railway station, right? They went in the other direction. And then there's the big eminence of Mount Currie. And way in the background, if you look on Google, and you're able to see on a map what's down there, they're actually, you know, nice tall snow-covered mountain down there that really could be that one. So that's, you know, I'm not saying definitively by any means, but it's, you know, a reasonable possibility, I think. that that's where she was, and that that one really is quite representational. So she was only in Pemberton for 5 days. We know one of them she spent doing the Harvey Hill thing.
Right. Yeah.
So she'd have had to have somebody take her out there.
Yeah, I'm like I say, that's just what came to my mind.
Listen, I really wrestled with this. It was like, you know, I drove out there looking for, okay, what could we have? I don't know. It's interesting, isn't it?
Because originally Laurie thought it was up the valley, and I said,
Yeah.
well, the farms are too far apart. There's
Yeah.
nowhere up the valley.
Yeah, where it looks that.
The buildings are so tight, like it must be a rendition of
Well,
town.
and the buildings themselves, like, they just don't seem.
Yeah, but
to
don't, you know, and
be
again, we
built.
can't say that she was being completely representational, because she
Right.
could have just made buildings, because she wanted buildings in there.
Domingo, I've done the walk up here towards the old rifle range to the waterfall,
Right, yeah.
and there's that point where it's like an aerial view of town. And I wondered if it was some interpretation of that.
Yeah.
It could.
So that really brings us to the end of that trip. So from 1933 forward, Emily never made another big expedition. All of her work was within this small area of Victoria. Now she went out, this was the period where she had her famous little RV,
Right.
the elephant, from 1933 to 1938. And when she didn't have the elephant, she stayed in cabins and so on. So she went out on major expeditions, sketching trips, for 6 to 8 weeks each year, both in the spring and in the fall. And this is when she developed the oil on paper technique that she became so famous for. So that's happening at this point. And one of the things I find really fascinating is that, you know, all of Emily's forest pictures, all of her trees, right? All of these monumental wilderness kind of things, they were all painted here. None of them come from her time up in this country or up in the Skeena or Haida Gwaii. None of them. They were all done in this period around Victoria. One of her biographers, who was a close friend of hers and used to go sketching with her, Edith Hembroff-Schleicher, and she says that Emily was the only person she knew who could sit in front of a tree and paint a forest. Yeah. Interesting. And of course, now we get into the time of her twin careers. So in her 50s, in the 1926 was the first writing class that she took. And she starts to write and is handling, is producing the very, very best of her painted work. And her health is terrible. She had a heart attack in 1937. She had more heart attacks after that. She had more than one stroke. She was in awful shape.
I was surprised.
But she just kept going, right?
Wow.
I didn't realize
How really sick
hard
she
it
was.
was. for
Yeah.
her.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why she was writing, right? Because for a long period, she didn't have the strength to be able to stand up at the easel or work or do any of the painting
Right.
stuff. She just couldn't. Yeah.
But amazing that she was able to write after having small strokes.
Seriously, you know? It just, oh, what do you do with this woman? And then finally, on March 2nd, 1945, she died at this place, which at the time was called St. Mary's Priory. It was a nursing home run by Anglican nuns, exactly 1 block from the house in which she was born. Her whole life came full circle, right to that same place. It's now the James Bay Inn. You can actually stay there. I've had lunch there. I know I can't bring myself to go and stay overnight in the place that Emily died. That just doesn't seem quite right. And she's buried at Ross Bay Cemetery, just along Dallas Road in Victoria. And it's these pictures were taken just a couple of weeks ago. I tend to go there sort of whenever I'm in Victoria. And it's one of the things that shows me how people still connect with Emily Carr, because whenever you go there, you see that her grave has got things like this around it, and it's always different. I went back just a few days ago, and all the cones were gone. And the folks at the cemetery, you know, the friends of the cemetery keep it tidied up, and so the cones were gone. And there was new, like there were painted stones, and people leave feathers, and they leave pens and paintbrushes, and you know, I brought a stone from Haida Gwaii and left it, and you know, so it's. People go, every time I go, I see other people there.
Like a shrine.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And of course, she'd think that was complete phone wall, but you know, people care about her. So I'm often asked what this whole journey has meant to me. And so here are some thoughts. First of all, it's taken me to places and allowed me to meet people I never, ever would have if I hadn't been following Emily Carr. Just wouldn't have happened. It's allowed me to gain a much greater understanding of Indigenous culture and I think aspirations and just thinking. I've often been invited into studios and homes and places. I've been able to connect with Indigenous people like I would not otherwise really have done at all. And it's really been greatly to my benefit. I've learned about Emily Carr's art now. Actually know a little bit about her art. And I've gotten to know her a lot through her writing, the journals and the letters and her stories. And I've come to see Emily Carr as being completely relevant today. And I think she's got some real things for us to learn. What is it that fascinates me about her? Well, you talk about this towering talent. I mean, in two different disciplines. It's just, you know, sort of passes understanding that one person could have had so much talent.
And energy.
And energy, incredible energy. And here we go, her determination. She stuck to it no matter what got in her way, whether it was what people thought or her financial situation or her health or whatever. She just always kept at it. Her self-sufficiency, that practical streak that we always got. She managed to support herself and keep herself going. Now she did have help from her sisters. She wasn't completely alone in this, but you know she was out there driving for herself. And her creative problem solving, like the baby buggy, and there are dozens of examples of that kind of thing. She was just a practical problem solving kind of person. I mean, her whole oil on paper technique, that was another one of these, right? Her interest in and understanding of people. Emily had a reputation for being quite prickly, but you just have to read her stories to see that she understood human nature. She got what people were about. Her attitude toward Indigenous people was so far ahead of her time that it's just inconceivable, really. And that she would be so comfortable now at our time of reconciliation. She would completely understand this and plot it. And she'd be so thrilled at seeing the reawakening and the blossoming of Indigenous culture that's gone way beyond anything anybody, you know, she thought it was dying, and instead it's so invigorating. She would love that. That commitment to lifelong learning. And I think that's an important lesson for us, isn't it? That's a big one. And her relentless work ethic. It didn't matter, she just kept going. It didn't matter what got in her way. So here's my point, is that I really think she's a standard bearer for successful aging. I think that people, you know, my age, can look at Emily and say, okay, what do we do? Well, we keep growing and trying and learning, and, you know, that's... Hey? Traveling. All the things, she gave us that. So we know that her work is now recognized internationally and sells in the millions. The Crooked Stare, which is held by the O'Dane, they bought for $3.3 million. It seems so sad when you think of what she went through. Her books have been continually in print for more than 70 years. Just a role model for today.